Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this double inaugural for two of the university's Humanitas chairs. Let me start by saying a word about the Humanitas programme. It's a series of visiting professorships, both to Oxford and to another university, that's a silly joke, to Cambridge, intended to bring leading practitioners and scholars to both those ancient seats of learning, to address major themes in the arts, the social sciences, and the humanities. It's now been running for a few years, and it's already making a really great contribution to the intellectual life of both those institutions. It was created by Lord Weidenfeld. The programme was managed and is funded by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in collaboration with a number of very generous benefactors, and in Oxford it's administered by the Humanities Division. The two Humanitas chairs that we have today are the chair in contemporary art, which is made possible by the great imaginative philanthropy of Ivorypress, and the chair in museums, galleries, and libraries, which is made possible by the tremendous benefaction and generosity of Foster and Partners. So I begin by acknowledging those great acts of philanthropy and thanking those donors and those inspirations on behalf of us all and on behalf of the University of Oxford. So we're here to talk about creativity and about curatorship, which might seem very different sorts of human activity, but it's always seemed to us that they're very closely related kinds of human activity, which is why these two chairs have always been, so far in their history, paired off one with another in joint events. You haven't come to listen to me, but being an Oxford Don, I can't resist telling you one anecdote. My favourite anecdote about a curator. I can't claim I have an enormous repertoire of anecdotes about curators, but my favourite one is about Kenneth Clarke, Lord Clarke of Civilization, who was, as you will all remember, or will all know at least, curator of the National Gallery in London for many years. And in one of his autobiographical writings, Kenneth Clarke remembers stealing into the galleries long before opening time and looking at one of the great canvases, which, as I remember, is a canvas by Velázquez. What he does in front of this canvas, in the silence of the empty gallery, is to move slowly to and fro, looking at what's in front of him and trying to find the precise point, the precise distance away from the painting where an abstract arrangement of pigments and paint suddenly modulates into a recognizable human scene with an implied human story. And I like to think of him at 6:30 in the morning, or whatever it is, hovering around, trying to find this precise spot where the materials of art somehow magically come together to create an artwork. It happens very vividly for realist painters like Velázquez, but it also would happen for any kind of art, abstract art, film, my own field, poetry. It's a lovely story. I like it for many reasons. I like it partly because it shows the wonderful inwardness that a great curator can have with the works of art that he hangs upon his, or she hangs upon her walls, that something about the intimacy of life with these works of art gains a special kind of inwardness with their powers and their textures and ambiguities. I like it also because of all sorts of questions it raises, some of which I think we're going to touch on in our lectures today. It's great that Clarke was having these extraordinary, valuable experiences, but there's an irony involved in the fact that they were solitary experiences before the doors opened. Clarke was, of course, a fantastically successful curator who established the National Gallery at the very heart of a national culture. And so there's a kind of a tension involved, which is interesting and worth exploring, between the solitariness which makes his own experience so valuable in recollection and the institutional nature of the occasion or the institution in which it took place. And thirdly, it seems to me that in its own way, this little episode shows the sort of juggle or the or the tensions between something very private about the way that we value artworks, but also something very public about the way in which artworks are kept and preserved and cherished. This is a private experience, but happening in a massive public institution. And that sort of brings together many of the intensely private creative decisions, but also the public sorts of context in which those decisions are taken, which must characterize any artwork, but perhaps especially artworks that grow against a background of conflict and civil strife and historical trauma. So it's in the belief that these apparently different disciplines of curatorship and creativity actually have a very rich overlap and therefore a very rich kind of dialogue that we are delighted to have with us today, the incumbents of these two chairs. The Humanitas Professorship of Contemporary Art, which is based at Magdalen and looked after by my colleagues Christine Ferdinand and Paul Bonaventura, and the Humanities Professor for Museums, Galleries and Libraries, based at Balliol and looked after by me. My name is Seamus Perry. This year's Professor of Contemporary Art is William Kentridge, who is one of the most successful, preeminent and internationally distinguished artists of South Africa. He's a student of politics, of mime, of theatre, whose works encompass TV, film, theatrical expression, and very much else as well. The diversity of the media in which he imagines is reflected in the diversity of venues in which his work has been exhibited, which include the Louvre, La Scala, both the Metropolitan Opera and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. There's a touring exhibition currently going around Britain under the auspices of the Hayward, and he has also recently appeared in Sao Paulo, the relevance of which will become immediately clear. In 2010, he received the Kyoto Prize in recognition of his contributions in the fields of art and philosophy. In 2011, he was elected an honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And last year, he was the Charles Eliot Norton Lecturer at Harvard. And academic prestige doesn't get much higher than that particular invitation. The director of the gallery in Sao Paulo, who curated that show, is the current professor, this year's professor of museums, galleries and libraries, Ivo Mesquita, who I'm delighted also to welcome to the platform. He has a very long and distinguished career as a curator, not just in Brazil but around the world, including the Brazilian Pavilion at the 48th Venice Biennale in 1999 and the 53rd in 2009. Between 1996 and 2007, he was a professor at the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College in New York. And as well as these many distinctions, he is also a very widely published art critic and theorist of the museum. I'm delighted and honoured to welcome them both here to Oxford today. The running order will be first William Kentridge and then Ivo Mesquita, then we'll have some questions, and then we'll go to the reception next door where there'll be a chance to grill our two professors further over a glass of Chardonnay. But first, let me hand over to William Kentridge for our first lecture.
There's always a difference between the clarity and explicitness of a lecture, that it will follow a clear line of argument from a beginning through a development to a conclusion, a difference between this clarity and the mess that lies behind this line that finally appears. It's a bit similar to the question that Freud poses in his interpretation of dreams, where he poses the question, unanswerable, whether in fact dream images appear to us concurrently, all the images at the same time, or consecutively. and whether the order we give to these different images when we describe the dream at the end, which comes out as a linear story, as a film that we can tell ourselves or others, whether this in fact is a kind of violent redistribution or reconstruction of what was in fact a very different series of thoughts. And one of the things I'm interested in looking at today is, as it were, the prehistory of the lecture itself, of what is the nature of those different thoughts and clashing of images and ideas, which in one form or another, through different acts of violence, have to come to resemble the linear progression of thought we associate with the idea of a lecture. This turning of these dream thoughts into the manifest dream Freud refers to as the secondary revision, what we tell ourselves as we're waking up of the story as we try to remember it before it disappears into sleep. And I suppose what I'm doing is an attempt at an interpretation and a deconstruction of this secondary revision. So this notebook, which is sequentially ordered from page 1 to page 10, I'm starting at 1 and I'm going to the end, is very different from the two other notebooks which preceded it, which were full of a mass of different possible ideas, of thoughts that could come together, and which I then had to study in the days and weeks preceding our meeting here, trying to understand what it could have meant, what I could have meant when I wrote these inexplicable statements, which at the time were clear, but which lose their clarity a moment later. And in this, I want to use the studio and the idea of the studio as both the location for this taking of different fragments and constructing something from it, and also the model of what we do when we try to shift between different ideas that are around us to a clarity of a trajectory. Now, the title of this lecture comes from some months ago when I was asked to make up a title and didn't quite know, so I thought, well, I'd talk about what it was in the studio. And at the time it was fairly clear that it would be about the activities of the studio, and there were a couple of other phrases in the book which acted as aid memoirs rather than as clear titles, to know these are things that should be spoken about when we were meeting. And then another couple of phrases that came on which at the time made a reference to something very specific, but which for the life of me I cannot begin to remember what. There must have been an article about people at CERN chasing a muon, but I've forgotten too much about muons to know what the connection was. And so what follows is a kind of reconstruction of what those ideas could have been. Those ideas were mainly established once when I was doing a walk along the beach at the south coast of South Africa in our summer holiday, and I had a long walk on the beach, and I thought I have to, by the end of the speech, know what I'm going to be saying in Oxford in 4 months' time. And I returned with great clarity, but I realized it's the kind of clarity you sometimes have in a dream also, where you wake up and you think, I've got this great idea, and you pull it into wakingness with you from deep sleep, and in the cold light of waking, it turns to ash. You realize what seemed like a really funny joke in a dream is really extremely stupid. What seemed like a brilliant connection is very, very flat. But when I talked of a walking tour of the studio, one of the things I was referring to is very directly that, the physical activity of walking in a studio. And here I want to make a distinction between the walking I was doing on the beach and the kind of walking that happens in the studio, which of necessity is a circling of a space, going past the basin, past the drawing table, around the sofa, back to the drawing table, crossing back to the wall where the camera is, and literally circling and circling. And it is something which sometimes happens for an hour before the first mark is put on a sheet of paper. And the nature of this walk, it has on the one hand to do with a gathering of energy, of impulses that are hovering at the edge of the idea until there's a moment of energy and clarity and the first mark is made. So it's a kind of procrastination. It is a waiting, it is putting off the time when your piece of charcoal or ink has to hit the sheet of paper and the process begin. But it's what I would describe as a kind of necessary and, being optimistic, a productive procrastination. There's something in that physical activity of the walk in the studio for me. There's something about what it is to be falling and catching yourself, which is the activity of walking. The repetition of the weight changing from the left leg to the right leg and back that shakes one's brain, that allows ideas to emerge that for me never come if I'm simply sitting and waiting, in which case there's a deep neutral. The brain goes into a deep neutral and nothing will happen. And I'll sit for 10 minutes and I'll say to myself, you'll see, nothing's happening. Wait another 10 minutes, nothing will happen. So there's something about that walking. And in the studio, what there is also, which is not there on the beach, is a kind of peripheral vision. A peripheral vision to the traces of other projects which exist on the walls of the studio, sketches, half-begun projects, old projects, the remnants of old projects, phrases, newspaper cuttings, all the usual paraphernalia of studio. So you have the activity of walking, you have a kind of peripheral vision, and you would have what I would describe, which I think becomes an important category, and that is that of peripheral thinking. Those ideas that start to impinge and emerge in your head without being the focus and center of the chasing down of an idea. And one of the things that happens in the studio in the process of making, because it is fundamentally a physical activity of making marks, of erasing, of redrawing, of there always being a gap between your head and your thinking and the arm, and a kind of reliance on a motor memory of the hand for ideas to emerge, as well as a direction from the brain, a kind of combination between those two controls and different unconscious memory. That seems important. And it's not to say that the motor memory or the action of the hand is the same as one unconscious in dream work at all. But there is something about a different kind of intelligence or approach to understanding that comes in this physical activity of art making. And so what happens in the studio is what happens when one's writing any lecture or doing any work, but perhaps in the studio emblematically, is that the world comes into the studio in the form of images, ideas, thoughts, conversations, whatever the things are, either physically on the wall, and those physical things on the wall, drawings and text standing in for ideas. The world comes into the studio, and the studio becomes a place for it to be deconstructed, taken apart, and then re-put back together. And one thinks of the collage as a particularly 20th century artistic phenomenon, but in fact in its very nature of pasting together different fragments of the world, and from that constructing a possibly coherent world, one understands it's a very central category, both for artistic activity and artistic activity as a metaphor for how we think in general. So this idea of taking the world in and splitting it apart is one of the central activities in the studio. And perhaps to make this much more concrete, we can talk about one very simple way in which one takes the world as a single thing and splits it apart. If you think of the very simple activity of what it is making a drawing in the studio. So one thinks of the paper up on the wall, and yourself as the artist looking at it, trying to feel out where the different moments of it could start, where a possible horizon is, when there's a kind of a half projection onto the sheet of paper of a possible drawing that could happen on it. Understanding that the drawing will be a conversation between what the paper gives and what you self do. But very soon there comes a secondary split. And that is when you step back from being the artist as maker of the drawing and yourself as a viewer of that which you have made. When one steps back as if someone else had made the work, and you can very clearly see that, no, in fact, the shoulder of the rhinoceros is in the wrong place. And who was the idiot drawing it that put it so low? You could see at a moment it's wrong. You must shift it up, and that the whole length of it feels wrong, and you could do it. And you give yourself mentally a series of notes, so when you step back to make the drawing, you can go back and correct these things that you have done. And there's a very real sense of split, in the sense of the person viewing being all-knowing and the person actually doing the drawing being really dumb and stupid and not getting it right. And a frustration that the one cannot be more sympathetic and attuned to what the other shows him. I mean, if you could just look and see, you can see that you need to lift the tail. The belly's in the wrong place. You can get that up. It's not so hard to draw a rhinoceros. What is the struggle to do this? It's a simple thing. He's done it many times before. You can go it up. We should remember we've also got the dentist the next day, the things that have to be kept in one's head. And in fact, he has many useful books. There are many useful books. If he just look at one of these books, he could understand what a rhinoceros looks like, instead of struggling away blindly, thinking I mean, if you would just listen to what the other person was saying, everything would be so much clearer.
Look here, you can see that it's wrong. You need to
So this is the first example of the kind of split and of taking of the world apart in a very immediate sense, of a shift between oneself as subject being coherent and understanding that this coherence, not to say we aren't coherent, but understanding that the coherence is a construction. And that behind this clarity and certainty of who one is and what one's doing are a series of uncertainties, either in conflict or not in conflict with each other, which one constructs into a possible sense, much as the different possible fragments of the lecture here get constructed into an appearance of coherence. One of the other things that happens in the studio and in the walking around the studio, of necessity, becomes a kind of trust in the material. Once the drawing has begun, there's a conversation between that which appears and that which one imagines appearing. That the drawing becomes a membrane between the world and yourself, both for the artist making it, where you have a sense of a rhinoceros outside in the world, and the sheet of paper on which there is some representation of it, and one's projection of what a rhinoceros is onto the drawing. This is done by the artist, but it's obviously done by everybody who is looking at the drawing also. You take a series of abstract shapes, what Kenneth Clark was talking about in the painting by Velázquez, and there are a series of abstract oil paint marks, brush marks. And at a certain point, suddenly it turns into the edge of a cape, or the lace around the collar of an infanta. And what is happening there is obviously not simply that the paint is a collar of an infanta. It's not. We can see clearly it's a series of white brush marks against an Antwerp blue cloth piece of paint behind it. But at a certain point, what happens is our projection of certain possible shapes, images, meets the drawing halfway. And the drawing becomes, or the painting becomes, this membrane between the world coming towards us and our projection of our ideas or images onto it. And this becomes patently clear in the example of Kenneth Clark, or in all the things we do when we're looking at a drawing. So what the studio activity does is not invent a new idea about how we approach the world, but taking things that are invisible, which we know but we don't see, and making them palpable. Taking processes that we kind of take for granted and putting them on the center stage as the subject matter of what it is to be at work in the studio. To take the process, again, to hark back to the same idea, of the fragments of ideas and thoughts that get pushed into shape as a lecture, and to make that disassembly the subject of the lecture itself. The circling of the studio, which I spoke about, has another echo, an implication, and that has to do with the nature of repetition. Repetition in that this endless circling like a zoetrope, in which the same action is endlessly reenacted as the zoetrope swings around, something that's in motion but in a sense static, that gets to the same place, that never gets to a new position. This zoetrope of action of walking around the studio has in it a kind of narrative push, as if in the next circuit of the studio an idea would emerge, as if the next time round the idea will be there that will enable the walking to stop and the drawing to begin. In terms of the lecture, it is echoed in the way in which I find in the old books. The same thing was written 12 times. The same notes were written down 12 times in the hope that in the 13th time of writing there would suddenly be the connection that would enable the next set of ideas to emerge. And in the sphere of activity in the studio, there are many things which emerge as variations on a theme, a same image being painted again and again. Painting a coffee pot, and then repainting a coffee pot. These particular coffee pots were a kind of productive procrastination to avoid writing the Norton lectures for Harvard a year ago. At least it felt I was doing something, and then these turned into a series of lino cuts, and the lino cuts started having their own life themselves. But one of the things that emerged from this painting of these coffee pots endlessly, and there were 20 or 30 of them, and they got turned into a series of lino cuts, was what one hopes for, which is the emergence of a kind of secondary meaning, something that the material itself brings to bear that isn't there in the starting point of the images. And this, in a strange way, had to do with the good paintbrushes I was using with the fantastic Indian ink turning into bad brushes, and what the bad brushes had to offer. So there are some brushes that hold their point very well, like the one I'm using over here, which can hold its shape, and you can do a fat line or a thin line, and it holds itself well. And I'll come later to talk about the nature of the books which are being defaced, which is a dangerous topic here, I know, in so many astonishing books. And this bad brush, you can see here the point, and I think it was a cheap brush and I mistreated it, but it doesn't keep a good point. It keeps flaking out into those many strands, which, not this fat brush here, it gives it many, many strands, and that in itself suggested a kind of featheriness that wasn't completely appropriate for the coffee pot, but which suggested a kind of a looseness and growth and multiplicity that turned into a series of trees. And so for the last while, and certainly in the period I've been working on this lecture, there's been a series of trees emerging in the studio, mostly to try to take cognizance of what these brushes could do. Here's a coffee pot painted with the good brush, and then after it was trying to do the same thing with the very broken up brush. Okay, so that's the broken up brush, which gives a very different kind of mark. So working with this bad brush and these different fragments, what I started doing was growing trees, allowing trees to start emerging from fragmentary sheets done on pages, which could gradually be collaged together to allow some kind of tree form to emerge. But here, I'm going to pause for a moment. This is where we start to get one of the real messy parts of the lecture, where the clarity of trying to pull the different pieces together stops. And it stops because I'm not sure which of several strands are the true ones, where the truth lies. there are three origins to the trees. And I'll talk briefly about the three origins as an example of a kind of constellation of ideas coming together to force one image together, and where again the clarity of a line seems to come from the overabundance of concurrent images or thoughts. Some months ago, I was speaking to some friends of ours in Cape Town, Basil and Adrian, and I asked Basil what Adrian was doing, who's a puppeteer. And he said, Adrian is busy making a tree search. And I thought, what is a tree search? And then even as I thought it, of course, a tree search is an internet term for tracking down some information. You put in the first piece of information, and that's like the trunk, and you can follow it up different branches and find subheadings of knowledge and different pieces of information, or go back down the trunk. This is a tree search. And at the end of the conversation, I said to Basil, okay, what was this research that Adrian was doing? And he said, what do you mean? I said, you said he was doing a tree search. And he said, no, I didn't. I said he was making a T-shirt. So what was interesting was that I'd misheard the word, but in the moment of mishearing the word, had first cursed myself for stupidity, and then invented this whole other world of research and diagrams and what it could be, as if it completely existed. And this is interesting not for the idea of a tree search, which is not an intelligent idea, but as a demonstration of the need and the irrepressible need we have of making sense of the world, of taking incoherent fragments, this phrase tree search, and constructing a possible coherence out of it, taking two different phrases, as one would with a dream thought, and making this complicated dream out of it in the same sort of speed one would make an image in a dream. In half a second, this whole etymology and history and examples of tree search is all there. That was the one origin of the trees, and in a way the trees that I was constructing became a kind of demonstration of this tree search. But there's another completely different line of possible origins of these trees which are being drawn. And this again has to do with etymology. Between the ages of 3 and 6, when I was between the ages of 3 and 6, my father, who was a lawyer in South Africa, was working every day on what was known as the treason trial, a trial of 156 members of the African National Congress who were on trial for treason, including Nelson Mandela, between 1958 and 1961. In the end, they were finally all released and acquitted. But to my 4 or 5-year-old head or 3-year-old head, I always had the association much more domestically. At the bottom of our garden, there was a group of fir trees, and on our stoep we had a mosaic table, which we used to talk about the tiles on the table. So for me, for all those years, my father went off every day to the treason tile. And my wife said to me, oh my God, you're still painting the damn treason trial, which are these trees made up out of different sheets of paper like different tiles that go together. So that's another possible origin of the overdetermination of the ideas of these trees. And the third origin of the possible of these trees has to do with the nature of painting in books, of taking, in this case, I suppose appropriately, 19 copies of the 1953 edition of the Shorter Oxford English Dictionary, published here from Oxford, and constructing these trees and their texts on their pages. And the texts that emerged were both a mixture of phrases that I needed for this lecture and other phrases that were floating around the studio to be used at some later stage. Now, I'm not sure how far one can go in finding the parallels between dream work, the activity we do when we transform ideas into a manifest dream, latent thoughts into a manifest, whether the ideas of condensation and displacement that one does in dreaming are the same as the processes that are done in the studio, whether the different centering the apparent emphasis in what is there in a dream and the real emphasis in the thoughts behind it, how closely one can follow this up. And certainly I'm not interested in the Freudian project of tracing these elements back to a primary trauma, to the amino acid of some primary trauma, which is what analysts do if they're dealing with neurosis. What I am interested in showing the parallel of is that these processes are the fundamental kind of building blocks of how we do understand the world and force an understanding onto it, the kind of links and jumps and visual and verbal games, not that we can do, but that we can't stop ourselves from doing. The idea of wordplay, the idea of words as objects in the trees either as tonal elements like lines or as objects in the trees as ideas associated with trees itself, or as kind of metaphor. And again, it's not to try to track down the amino acid of the basic first trauma, but rather to acknowledge these processes and in a way to celebrate them and revel in those possibilities they then release into us. Now, on the beach when I was doing the first walk, and that's when the first time I thought, this feels to me like I should be talking about dream work. And it was only much later when I was back off the beach that I thought, well, I'd better read the 300 pages in the Interpretations of Dreams on dream work, which I hadn't looked at for 20 years. And found moments of coalescing. For example, I discovered that Freud talks a lot about the rebus as an idea. A rebus in which you take words and phrases and images and take the sound of an image like an I to mean the same as I, and make those kinds of connections which allow for visual or linguistic absurdities, but which can translate into a different kind of sense. And to think that those kinds of transformations become very important in how one allows things in the studio to happen, whether it is from a bad brush transforming itself into the idea of a tree, which is both a way of arriving at a series of drawings of trees, but also a way of trying to arrive at what is the strange relationship to my younger history and my father in the treason trial. What is the relationship of ideas sprouting from a tree, without having to say, well, the fundamental reason is A or B, but allowing the multiplicity of reasons to flow along. And this rebus idea of different images is something that one also does in the studio, where you have a series of concurrent images which are there in the studio. This was a section of the lecture about the amino acids of drawing, going back to Cézanne, to the sphere, the cone, and the cube, which he said were the building blocks of all images, and thinking, what do these suggest, where the sphere can become a globe, and the cone can become a megaphone, and the cube can become a cage, where you take these basic images and say, what are the associations that can spread out from them? What are the other ideas that then spread out onto these sheets of paper? Once one is saying, now what has arrived in the studio is the idea of multiplicity of pages to be reread, a kind of second-hand reading, a reinscribing of texts and books, to take the logical progression of them out, to allow a much more associative set of images to emerge. And I thought I needed then to make a kind of transformation to show how one image could transform to another. So this started as a series of drawings of turning a bird into a cage, or a fruit bowl into a cone, or a woman into a typewriter. Different kind of vague associations, different things which one could see how they were done. As drawings, then I thought, well, maybe I should make them as cardboard sculptures, so they became cardboard sculptures. And at first they were just very simple drawings, thinking what happens if you change the order of a series of images. As if one's rewriting a narrative. What is the cause? Is A the cause of B? Does the tree get turned into the chair? Almost as if you're saying, here are a series of picture books and you can read them in different ways to a child in very different ways. And after this, they changed from these drawings into pieces of cardboard cutout, and from the cardboard cutout into three-dimensional objects, like these in which the sculptures themselves would turn and transform from the fruit bowl to the cone, from the megaphone to a square. And in a way, this was like the longest piece of procrastination. This was a vague idea on the beach walk that turned into these paper drawings, into the cardboard sculptures, into a foundry working to turn these into bronze casts. And this, in fact, I thought, I've been working on this lecture for months. And I realized, no, I'd been making these sculptures for months, avoiding working on what the text of the lecture would have to be. As if it's a kind of hieroglyph in which there's an invitation to the viewer to make a possible sense or nonsense, or to take simply the possibility of sense as what it is that they offer rather than an actual interpretation. And there was a final shift from, or backward step from these sculptures. And that was taking all the sheets of paper which had been accumulating during this time of phrases, of images that were being used for sculpture, and saying, right, let them go back into a book. And the book, like the tree, gets kind of overdetermined. There are multiplicity, there's a surplus of reasons for the book to re-emerge. Firstly, it has to do with the kind of paper or the kind of text. So certain books call to be drawn on by the way in which they absorb charcoal. There's some in which are very shiny paper in which you can brush a charcoal mark off very easily. There are certain books which aren't well sized, so they absorb Indian ink like blotting paper. And there are other sheets which hold the ink very beautifully and keep their flatness, like these pages of the Oxford Dictionary. There's a possibility of multiplicity, that you buy one volume and there are 970 or 1,270 pages waiting to be drawn. And you think of what it is in a dictionary that has to do with abundance of words. So many words one will never want, but one is so happy to have that 3 kilograms of weight in one's hand. There's a kind of animation in it, the way in which there are those thousands of frames of film there in a book waiting to be turned, a kind of flip book done on a larger scale. There's the narrative pressure of a book, the sense that it has a cover at the front and a cover at the back, and you open it and you get through and you get to the end. So unlike an ordinary ream of paper or a roll of drawing paper or a drawer full of drawing paper, it has the idea of narrative built into it. There's a kind of memory. One can always describe one's bookshelves as a kind of materialized self-portrait. One of the ways you can describe yourself is by the shelves of books that sit in your house. And one of the things that makes me anxious about Kindles is the dematerialization of the self. Not that one's going to reread all the books in one's shelf, but if they disappear, there's a sense of who would I be? There's the materialization of that which is invisible, which is to say taking all these vague thoughts and phrases and they get put onto these sheets of paper and the vague thoughts turn into 2.3 kilograms of paper. So all these multiplicity of ideas that push for these sheets of paper to go back into the book. I mean, there's the whole complicated status of the nature of books like this, particularly a book like the Oxford English Dictionary from 1953, which is not a rarity. The world is not going to be deprived if 10 volumes of it disappear from the thousands that are there. It's not a book that most people would need now. People, if they were using a real dictionary, would go to the larger one. If it was the kind of things in that, they'd look it up online. We used to have a battle in our house between my wife and myself on one hand and the children on the other, when a word had to be found, when we would run off to the library and they would go to their computers. But then internet speeds got faster in South Africa, and in truth, we all now just look it up on our phones. So there's a way in which that particular kind of book, of which one finds every second-hand bookstore loaded down, become a treasure trove of raw material. And let it be said, let me reassure people who are the guardians of wonderful rare books here at Oxford that there are no really old or valuable books that I have chosen to draw on. It's not about an iconoclasm. It's about a rereading, a reusing of the implicit thought inside those. So in the end, after having gone through notes and notebooks, drawings and sculpture, what emerged at the end of the process, and in fact is the ongoing part of this lecture, which continues past it to be finished in the next month, is the start of a kind of flip book, which is both about a narrative, it starts at the beginning and will eventually get to the end, but which acknowledges repetition, inconsistency, illogicality as part of its material. So I'm going to finish by showing a fragment of a work in process. And I'm not certain whether the book that I'm showing and whether the lecture that I'm giving now is simply a prelude to get to this book which is finally being made, or whether in fact the two together constitute the actual work. The music was added later, and it's nice, but it's not an essential part of it. In fact, there are two very different soundtracks with this. There's one with this very gentle Schubert, and there's another with a piece of Shostakovich, and there are many others. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks a lot for coming, to have your presence here. I am very pleased and honored by this opportunity to take part of this beautiful program, the Humanities Visiting Professorship. And so I would like to thank Oxford University, Balliol College, the Humanities program for this invitation. It's quite a special for me to be here and I thank you for that. I also like to thank your foster partner, Ivorypress, for their support to this program, and Elena and Norman, thank you so much for being here this morning. It's beautiful, es lindo verlos acá. I also, I'm very special, have a very special acknowledgement for Seamus Perry, Natalia Buka-Kovan, Paul Bonaventura, and Claire Oxenberg for their welcoming way of organizing everything for me to be here. Unfortunately, I have to read because I'm not so good with public presentations, and also despite my experiences as professor in an American college, I never felt comfortable without reading what I have to say. So sorry, it's going to take a little time here, but let's go. Museums, experience versus numbers. Before starting to write the text for this presentation, I read the speeches of the two previous participants of the Humanities Visiting Professorship, Glenn Lowry, director of MoMA, New York, and Michael Rodgen, director of MFA Boston, both respected and admirable professionals who have headed up a great initiative. Out of respect to them and to this professorship, I feel it is important to avoid being redundant, since the general terms, the organizations for which we are responsible, the art museums, are founded on the democratic principle that underpin our society, as well as on the tradition of their Western art history. And the problem the museums faces, the public, financing, legitimacy, the financial crisis, collections, the market, unions, are more or less the same, since they have currently become immensely popular as important strategy of the cultural and tourism industry, driving a large and powerful segment of the economy. But it's important to note that even though art museums all have basically the same purposes and actions: collecting, preserving, researching, exhibiting, educating. And despite the fact that art system is increasingly integrated and interdependent in the context of globalization, museums differ from each other considerably in terms of the role they carry out within their respective communities. They all have different notions concerning the nature and the scale of their communities, and it is difficult to even gain a precise idea of what the community is for museums that receive more than 1 million visitors a year. Perhaps the boards, committees, friends association, and members are the closest things to a community that they know, in light of the weight these organizations have, especially in regard to the tourism industry that drops off busloads of visitors at their front doors every day. It could be said that today the MoMA is no longer a museum of New York, but a museum located in New York, just as the Tate today is in London, the Bourbourg in Paris, and the Reina Sofia in Madrid. This is not to say that, And we are not talking only about museums of modern contemporary art, but also about its historical art museums, such as the Metropolitan, the National Gallery, the Louvre, and the Prado. This is not to say that they haven't developed some successful program aimed at local segments and partners, but this local audience is not what justifies the investments made in them. What assures their autonomy and institutional visibility are the millions of tourists they serve. I would like to bring a different perspective this year to this visiting professorship, something from south of the equator, with a distinct historical experience where museums are still an important instrument for the formation and consolidation of democratic societies. Even as we are watching the so-called mainstream institutions and circuit as they develop a fascinating body of ideas and strategy for deconstruct the traditional museum, the economy that feeds them, and their ideological models, for us, the moving force is still to construct. Once again, we are dealing with the same subject and therefore facing the same problem. We share the same credo and drink from the same sources. But our experience in museums south of the equator also involves specific experiences that we can offer as an original and consistent contribution to the general debate on the museums. For example, in regard of the current financial crisis that is dogging museums everywhere, cutting resources, paring away technical staff, and even closing many of them, our experience has always been one of living with crisis, as we have known few moments of political, economic, or social stabilities. Our museums reflect this. And while the consolidated institutions in the Northern Hemisphere are intensely concerned with meeting the challenges posed by institutional criticism, in the Southern Hemisphere, we have to finish construction and consolidating ours. We work with a universe of fragments that only make sense when perceived in relation to our mestizo body. We need to choose the fragment, as always, as use them as a basis for establishing foundations, measuring density, defining what is most relevant. With rare exceptions, our collections are the result of public and private initiatives unrelated to the history of or nature of the organizations, being, for the most part, unplanned, sporadic actions. I have, therefore, divided this text into three parts. The first is about my own personal background and how I became a museum professional. The second part presents the Pinacoteca, where I am the director, and the third part and final part consists of a series of observations and comments about the current situation of museums and what, in my opinion, are the great challenges they face today. The confrontation between quality and quantity, knowledge and information, intellectual work, and capitalist productivism. Altogether, this three parts constitutes a brief appraisal, the outlining of a stand in relation to the interplay of forces that drive the relationship between museums and society in a globalized world. 1. The discovery of the object of desire. I think that it all began when I was 11 years old and visited Rio de Janeiro for the first time, brought there by my grandparent. It was in the National Museum of Fine Arts where I came upon what was to define my personal life, purpose, and professional path from then on. It was a painting, not the first I had seen in my life, but the first outside of the family context of portrait, landscape, and still life, entitled The Last Tamoio, a painting by Rodolfo Moedo from 1883. This was the artwork that was to stay with me forever, appearing as a recurrent image, like a dream or a nightmare, at various moments of my life. It was influential, revealing, and transformative in my life. Clearly, in 1962, I did not have the insight regarding the meaning of this painting or of art that I have today. 50 years have passed since that first look, 40 years of academic and professional life, and a long span of psychoanalysis, but what I have learned since that first look has not had so much to do with the painting itself, the artist, or its historical context. Rather, it has involved what this painting and the entire terrain to which it's... Rather, it has involved what this painting and the entire terrain to which it belongs have taught me about myself as a subjectivity, as an individual, and about where the transformative and liberating power of art resides. The scene depicted in a painting, a sort of pietà, representing a cleric cradling the body of a naked Indian, lying dead at the seashore at the end of an overcast and gloomy day, as conveyed by the narrative atmosphere. The painting's theme referred to an episode in Brazil's colonial history, a war between Portuguese around 1560, between Portuguese and the Tamoios, who refused to be enslaved. The war wound up decimating this tribe, and about 300 years later, the occurrence was used as a theme of an epic romantic poem of great success in its time, The Confederation of the Tamoios, by Gonçalves de Magalhães. This literary work was a source of inspiration for the painter Amoedo in conceiving this work, which he painted in Paris during an artist's residence granted by the Emperor of Brazil. For me, the question was of another order. Not knowing about the narrative or the literature concerning the painting, what impressed me as a student in an all-boys Jesuit school was the nudity of the heroic body in counterpoint to the totally clothed cleric who cradled him in a Christian manner. Regardless of the epic and moral sense of this narrative, the most evident thing is the eroticism of the depiction, which is strongly present despite the conventional nature of its composition, the rules and procedures that structure its representation. In other words, the last Tamoio evoked in me something that I would only understand many years later upon reading and studying the Scopic drive and the theory of art as a product of sublimation based on the text of Sigmund Freud, Leonardo da Vinci, A Memory of His Childhood. For me, that image freed in my imagination a projection, a fantasy. And in the museum, there were much more images of that kind, which until that moment I had been prevented from seeing at home and at school by the censorship of films, books, and magazines as unsuitable for child's eyes. And yet, there they were for my solitary contemplation in a solemn and silent setting where the few visitors were free to gaze at them without interruption of any sort or of admonishment. I was free to look in amazement at those paintings from the past, at the realm of beauty, which, although they not look as real as the photographed images of the same sort, still managed to be just as unsettling and provocative. I filled me with an immense and previously unknown feeling of freedom. 5 years later, after that revealing experience with art, in that I discovered the museum of a place without censorship. In 1967, I experienced my first visit to the São Paulo Bienal, a space dedicated primarily to contemporary art. At that moment, despite the military coup in 1964, Brazil was still experiencing an explosion of creativity in cinema, theater, arts, visual arts, music, and literature. Under the impact of the confrontational and transformative socio-political mindset of the hippie movement, the sexual revolution, pacifism, and the hallucinogens, and the 9th São Paulo Bienal was a memorable show due to its energy, the vehemence with which it treated the real world and the intellectual political debate. It was a festival of colors, sound, and interactive artworks with an unconventional critical aesthetic which has no longer abstraction or concrete art. This was the last of a series of important shows of modern contemporary art that the Bienal has presented since its outset in 1951, before the censorship imposed on art, information, and culture by Brazilian military government starting in 1968. For me, personally, it was an unforgettable episode that once again gave me the sensation of freedom, the experience of a place and a practice where it seemed that everything was possible and permitted. That was the moment when I gained clear awareness of my vocation and what really interested me. From then on, everything brought me towards where I am now. At the following Bienal in 1969, after having taken my first art history course, I worked as an educator, leading guided visit groups through the show. Leading guided visits through the show. And I did that during the whole time I was graduating in journalism at the São Paulo University. I also attended an alternative school for training of artists, where I learned how to look at the work of art and about artistic process. It was also at this school that I perceived I was more interested in books on art history and artists than in the actual practice of itself, to look instead of to do. Another experience was fundamental in the definition of choices that brought me into this professional place, took place in 1968 at the inauguration of the building designed by Lina Bobard for the collection of the São Paulo Art Museum. The grandeur of the huge gray and red pavilion with its hard, brutalist architecture contrasted radically with the historical character of the museum artwork, which spanned from the Renaissance to Impressionism and early modernist vanguards. And it was notable not only for its contrast between the architecture and the museum collection, but also for the way in which the collection was presented to the visitor. Instead of being hung on walls, the paintings were attached to individual glass panels, placed side by side, form a series of lines of paintings which occupy a large space of glass and concrete. It was an impressive, provocative, disconcerting sight. The perspective formed by the accumulation of the artworks that seemed to be floating in the museum's interior brought about a flattening of art history, offering a view of many centuries and style at the same time. It was another conception of museum, stripped of its sacredness, without hierarchy, and possess its own unique time for the objects, that set of objects. Moreover, beyond her bold proposal for the new facilities of the Brazil's most important museum, on another floor of the building, the architect herself curated a show entitled The Hand of the Brazilian People, which featured a wide range of decorative, utilitarian, and religious objects made by craftsmen from different regions of the country. The two exhibitions showed us two categories of beauty and ingenuity. In this way, Lina Bobard took a heritage representative of the highest Western culture, a collection of art, and confronted it with a material and symbolic production from popular, anonymous origin arising from a Brazil considered uncultivated, primitive, and distant from the museum and from São Paulo. It was visually fascinating and intellectually challenging. I became a visitor of a museum of every sort. Certainly, at the age of 17, I did not perceive the entire breadth of the Lina Bobard gesture. She was making a tabula rasa of art history, deconstructing the notion of the Fine Arts Museum in order to propose an experience of the museum couched in a perspective of those members of society who had not participated in the construction of the narrative conveyed by the works in the collection. In this way, the museum finally offered a portrait of Brazil, of its society and values, and its paradox and contradictions. It taught us a new way of looking at art from a marginal perspective. Its proposal politicizes the museum at a moment of great political protest and countercultural movements. In 1974, I enrolled again the São Paulo University for a postgraduating program in art history. In that period, during various courses in art history and art and architecture, I developed an extensive body of research for thesis based on the collections of newspapers regarding the São Paulo Bienal, to be studied from 1951 to 1977. My plan originally was to establish the basis for a history of that institution. But when I was finishing the thesis, I received an invitation to work at São Paulo Bienal in 1998 as a curatorial assistant, which completely changed my academic plans. What I had previously seen from the outside, I was now looking at from within. I was one of the cogs of the machine, also responsible for its production. I have made my first professional choice. My career would not be an academic one. It was at the São Paulo Bienal that I began my professional life. It was there between 1980 and 1988 that I learned about curating, about organizing and producing exhibitions, drawing up budgets, working with artists in the development of specific projects, writing and editing publications. It was there that I produced my first couple of exhibitions as curator. I produced my first exhibition as curator. Also, I learned a lot by observing other curators at work while I began to travel systematically and to construct a professional network, particularly in Latin America. It's very important to perceive and understand the significant role played by the São Paulo Bienal in the formation of the cosmopolitan, internationalized character of Brazilian art from the 50s onward, and in the training of professionals in the local art world. Throughout more than 60 years, it has been constructing a sort of imaginary museum of the history of modern art, modern and contemporary art. All of the most important artists of the 20th century from around the world have participated in at least one edition of the São Paulo Bienal. And this history has been recorded in the memory of the successive generations who have visited it. Its legacy is immaterial. It has not accumulated the collection. Rather, its legacy resides in the experience of the gaze that it renews every 2 years in how it has educated the public with a taste for the contemporary art. Even at the lowest ebbs of its history, there was always something new and known which made it worthwhile to be there. But it was in that period, in the 80s, that the two transformative moments for the international art scene took place. The first was the emergence of the figure of the independent curator, the professional specialized in contemporary art, when most museums still did not have a specific sector or department dedicated to this. These independent curators were to become important agents in the process of globalization of the visual arts circuit, organize and participate in art biennials and fairs, programs of governmental agency, and artist residence projects. The other was the boom of Latin American art, its international visibility, its valorization by the art market, its inclusion in the mainstream circuits. What originally was rapidly institutionalized with the creation of funds, what originally arose as something coming from the fringe, as an alternative and as an austerity and specificity, was rapidly institutionalized with the creation of funds, collections, and departments of Latin American art and literature in various museums and universities and foundations, particularly in the United States. When I left the São Paulo Bienal, I became an independent curator and began working in various international projects, particularly in the United States, where there was a great demand for professionals, experts of Latin American art and culture. There were various projects that included me in an expert's role, and I was invited to give classes at the Center for Curatorial Studies of Bard College in New York in 1996, where I stayed for 11 years. The environment in a university is always more favorable for the work of research and investigation without the pressure of the world of organization and institutions such as museums and cultural centers. 2. The Pinacoteca do Estado, a contemporary museum of art history. I'm running a little bit late here. I go a little bit fast in this part. This is a view of São Paulo at the turn of the century. You have the train station in front, and then on the right side of the images is the Pinacoteca. This photograph is from 1905. It's the year that they inaugurated the Pinacoteca in São Paulo, because the building is from 1900 and was created as an arts and crafts school. And then in 1905, they decided to install an art collection on the second floor. And time went by, the school moved from that building, just to see a view of São Paulo from the same time. This is Pinacoteca in a view of 1982. And this is the current view of the entrance, the main entrance. We changed the entrance of the museum from the avenue to the park. We are near a park. So, the Pinacoteca is a state museum, belongs to the São Paulo state, and is our collection with more than 10,000 objects. Goes from colonial to date. This means that our program has to cover all these artistic periods and presenting this through the collection, but also through a temporary exhibition program. One of the main, this is our second facility, is by the same architect from this building. The first is from 1900. This is from 1913 by the same Brazilian architect, Ramos de Azevedo, who did all this kind of eclectic style in transforming São Paulo in an international capital or a cosmopolitan urban capital that it was not until the end of the 19th century. What another peculiarity about Pinacoteca is that despite we are a state museum, our management, our day-by-day, is run by the Friends of the Museum Association, which is a non-profit, a private organization for non-profit, and where there's this collaboration between the state public and the association private, made the museum much more flexible, because we are no longer subject to the politicians, we are no longer subject of the decisions of when they change the government. Another thing is that, back to Pinacoteca, Okay, this is some of the interesting things, despite it is a historical art history museum. Since the very beginning, Pinacoteca always got contemporary art for its collection, like this Pedro Weingartner painting from 1908, and was acquired in 1911 for the museum. Or this Tarsila do Amaral from 1924 was acquired in 1929. A Portinari painting for 34 and was incorporated in 35. Or this beautiful Lygia Clark creature from 61 that entered into the collection in 77. So in 1997-98, the Pinacoteca had a renovation by Brazilian architect Pritzker Prize winner Paulo Mendes da Rocha, who transformed the interior of the museum. I'm going to show you, this is just some views of the interior of the thing. What he did is he changed the museum was, you have to go all around. What he did, he put these two bridges that are linking the patios there. And also he put a roof that incorporating two open-air patios to the museum, to the interior of the museum. When he did that, opened this central space, this octagonal space, that in 2003 we decided to make the project room for the museum. And this project room is very important. Okay, some views of the collection, the way it is installed. We always, in many of the galleries, we always have contemporary art in dialogue with the historical art. This is a strategy of our educational department. A reading room. This is a view of Walter Sucalda, because we do shows Brazilians, the international contemporary modernist master, historical masters, and we have to produce some of the shows, and some of the shows we produce in partnership with some Brazilians or international organizations. So this octagonal space became the center of the museum, because in the past, you have to go all around to leave. Now, every time you can cross the museum, and then you cross this central space, you see contemporary art. As I mentioned before, the fact that we have to attend different periods of art history is important to keep in the center of the museum this contemporary art, making affirmative that the contemporary eyes is that what governs the museum. So this is a few projects developed by Brazilian artists. This is João Loureiro, this beautiful blue whale is life-size and was done based on a computer scanner, and is covered with blue jeans. So this is a piece by Celeste Boursier-Mougenot, Variation. It's a sort of Japanese garden with these pools with warm water, where there's all these bowls in porcelain. They keep floating, and when they touch each other, they make a sound. So this is very kind of Zen garden created in the interior of the museum. This is a project by Pedro Cabrita Reis, the Portuguese artist. Just a beautiful sculpture based on the deposition painting by Mantegna. This is José Bechara, who filled the whole space with tables, with these two chairs. Okay, let's talk. And of course, it's a personal history, because this is just an anecdote about this piece, because he was doing this piece while he had a personal problem at home. That gives the title. Okay, let's talk. So. And this is a project by Olafur Eliasson. Take your time. He installed this floating, circulating mirror in the top of the octagonal space, and you can see the back, you can see the roof, some other view of the piece by the effect of the piece by Olafur. After 10 years of intense work, the Pinacoteca has established itself as a benchmark institution representing a change of paradigm for Brazilian museums. In the same period, other institutions have flourished throughout the country, such as the Fundação Iberê Camargo in Porto Alegre, the Museu Oscar Niemeyer in Curitiba, and the Instituto Moreira Salles in Rio de Janeiro, where the beautiful project of the Museu de Arte do Rio Mar has recently inaugurated. We can also observe important change in museums throughout the Latin American continent, such as the creation of the Museum de Arte Latino-Americano in Buenos Aires, the advances of the Museum of Art de Lima, the Museu Banco de la República in Bogotá, and the Museu Universitário de Arte Contemporâneo in Mexico, as well as the magnificent projects and programs of the Museu de Antioquia in Medellin. We have certainly constructed a network of collaboration that is still not very systematic, and yet has led some productive and satisfying results. Nevertheless, none of these organizations can be described as consolidated, nor can they rest assured of the permanence of their technical and professional structure, their policies and programs, which are currently providing them with widespread visibility. They need to be consolidated, effectuated. This is the stage at which we found ourselves. Nothing is assured, as it is proven by the museums of art in Venezuela, which up until the 90s were considered among the best in Latin America, only to be subsequently devastated by the cultural policies of Hugo Chavez. As I mentioned earlier, we live in a state of crisis. The apparent vigor of the economy of some Latin American countries at this moment makes their museums attractive to the international commerce of exhibition, creating a strong north-south dialogue that is much more intense than the south-south one. The fact that there is no effective network of inter-museums collaboration, of systematic relation between neighboring countries, only reveals the paucity and frailty of our institution. Concerning this affluent commerce of exhibition that crosses the Atlantic from north to south, I would like to make two observations. The first is that although all of the shows, if well produced, are certainly welcome, the question is that they are offered as sealed packages, their contents closed, their mediation finalized. Perhaps they could achieve better results and leave something more effective and permanent beyond the spectacular that many of them have offered. This is a question of seeking new models of collaboration based on a deepened interchange, which takes into consideration the specificities, demands, and programs of the host institution. It's important to remember, in these days of globalized markets, all the commerce is an exchange, and therefore should always be a two-way street. The other has to do with the growing presence of sponsors and philanthropists from Latin America who were either born or resident there, who serve as members on the boards of Friends and the sponsors of international museums such as MoMA, Tate, Beaubourg, Reina Sofia, to whom they bring generous donations and have allowed for the formation of significant collections of Latin America in these institutions. This is well and good, since it is beneficial to both sides. The question is that these new international patrons of the arts could be stimulated by the same organization to also contribute to the museums of their own countries, most of which are not able to maintain a consistent and significant collection of local art, even though it has recently become mainstream. In any case, the present moment is one of optimism, not so much because of the generalized success of museums as a top product in the culture and tourism industry, which, for better or worse, has become very significant here as well. Certainly, the existence of a circuit of South American museums is an outcome of the growth of the industry as a whole, worldwide, but at the same time, they operate as of an artisanal, pre-industrial scale. Although being the object of consistent public policies or systematic investment, pre-industrial scale. Although founded on the thinking of the Enlightenment, these institutions have never been the object of consistent public policies or systematic investment. At the Pinacoteca, we have only very recently been able to ground our program and initiative on the basis of the collection understood as a collective material and symbolic heritage, able to transform the museum into a space of differentiated, unique experiences. We must affirm it at every moment as an essential apparatus for any project of basic collective education in light of the pressing needs of our society and the need to educate and raise awareness among individuals in order for them to think critically and fulfill their role as citizens. In parallel to this, we must also work to maintain relations with specific public of the art museum, with the specific public of the art museum, with artists and collectors, since we depend on them to continue and develop our collections and our programs. With the other local, also have to relations with the other local institutions, since we need a consolidated circuit, a strong economy and in the circuit. And finally, with the new patrons of the art, the companies and corporations who have been encouraging, who have been encouraged by marketing and tax incentive, tax deductions to take over the role of the state, which has removed itself from the management of culture. By discussing all of this constitutive aspect of a Brazilian museum, what I'm actually seeking to convey, and here I am not speaking only about the Pinacoteca, but about a Latin American perspective, is the context in which these museums and their professionals operate, which is somewhat specific to this latitude in the world, this culture, this moment. My aim here is not to take the role of a victim, which we are not. Rather, I'm calling attention to the specificity of the questions we must face. On one hand, we are challenged to bring about the local consolidation of museum as an open and inclusive public institution, serving to form a collective heritage and to foster a more democratic and just and equalitarian society. On the other, we must attend the highly qualified social segments that are necessary to the museum's objectives with demand and expectations of service consistent with global standards and reference. At first sight, this may seem like a schizophrenic goal, but it is not. It's part of a constant conflict of identity that we are going through between being Western and being the other. This is related to our condition as unconsolidated societies lacking every sort of infrastructure, with fragile institutions, weak legislation, the absence of official policies, and the lack of effective control over the public realm. The museums reflect this. Latin America is part of a process that we currently call globalization, which began in the late 16th century with the Baroque, which founded a fascinating visual and literary mindset on the continent, a heritage of wonders. What had come before this was depredated pillage. What survived is still bravely persisting in Chiapas or with the cocaleros in the foothills of the mountains of Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador. Certainly, an art museum is not a priority there. The other survivors have been assimilated or excluded and are confined on reservation or at the outskirts of the economy. Nevertheless, we have completed 200 years as independent nations. Therefore, the colonial past is part of a collective memory with a considerable critical and historiographic production. We are the New World, where the colonizer expatriated the natives to found and populate a continent of criollos, the term coined by the Spaniards to denote everyone who was born and who resides in the colonies, regardless of his, her, color, or ethnicity. Here we are always putting together pieces, melding fragments of many races, various history, different cultures. I believe that our difference lies in the fact that we are a product of ethnic mixing and not a hybrid, that notion which is currently a buzzword in the culturalist discourse. A hybrid product supposes something generated in the laboratory, planned and developed under clean scientific control, as it is done with seeds, flowers, fruits, and genes. Ethnic mixing, on the contrary, is the product of a collision, a clashing, an encounter confrontation of primary drives of desire, of relations of love and hate. But outside this racial peculiarity, the civilization that developed here, Western capitalist society, which also flourished in so many other places, came about in the name of God and business. It's not something that is completed, finished, but rather a peculiar process that is still full of contradiction and arbitrary aspect. And yet, it is always challenging and inspiring process, since there is still a lot to be done. And it must always be borne in mind that psychoanalysis is a discipline that flourished in Latin America, having been an important part of the program of the local modernism, producing an original and unique contribution to its field. For this reason, in the museums, we do what we can, but without resentment, Manichaeism, culpabilities. We forge ahead because the important thing is to always keep moving. What we cannot do is to stop talking, to stop doing. Three, experience versus numbers. Sorry, If there is some development that we can call unforeseen in the realm of museum, it was the boom of contemporary art, how it was converted in the art center into a spectacle within the economy of the exhibitions, dethroning the blockbuster shows of master of classical and modernist art, which it has also been surpassing in terms of price and value. It was something practically inconceivable for my generation. There was no circuit for emerging artist production. The artists, they had not to only make his artists or their art, but also create conditions for exhibiting their work, inserting them into a cultural circuit. It required generosity, idealism, and a great deal of libidinal investment when we compare it to the current, totally professionalized scene with organized relations of production, a powerful and institutionalized economy of today. Certainly, there was something underway at pioneering museums such as the Stedelijk in Amsterdam, the Moderne Museum in Stockholm, or the Kunsthal of Bern, among many others, which had expressed commitment with the promotion of contemporary art that was more cutting-edge and experimental, to use a term from the time, lending it some institutional visibility. But it was after the opening of Beaubourg in Paris that this process seems to have accelerated, becoming large scale with intense mediatic visibility. It transformed the institutional scene, brought new public sectors to the museum, and created services. Up to then, the museums were above all a conservatory responsible for collecting and preserving the nation's material and symbolic heritage, representing the highest degree of wealth, power, development, and civilization. They were assigned the role of recovering the accelerated time of progress that which would have been destroyed or sacrificed for the sake of the constantly new. In the late 70s, however, this museum had to adapt itself to the new reality imposed by the growing awareness of the importance of the present time of daily life. Alongside this change, in the orientation of the critical and academic debate, proposing revisions of the art history, the end of canonical interpretation, proposing alternative narratives with new selection and ordering for museums' collection, allowed for the rise of other methods for presenting artistic production, of new critical frameworks and conceptual structure, which transform it and expand the role of art collection and exhibition. Today, the public wants to understand the signs that point to the newest, the most recent development, the manifestation of personal and original worlds, just like themselves as individuals who photograph themselves at every moment and post on the social networks. In a society centered by the media, people want to consume and be part of great event. It seems that the museum visitor wants to experience the future before it takes place. Art is also part of the entertainment industry, and in the culture of spectacle, the museum, the exhibition, the biennial are respectable. We have fun while believing we are educating ourselves. This shift from aesthetic contemplation to the assimilation of the contents of art has created new social and programmatic demand for the museum, enlarging its function. Now, it should be didactic and educational in a wide sense and accessible. It should engage community and be popular by politically and socially active, Above all, it should serve the patrons and the sponsors who are now making it economically viable. Today, the visual art circuit or system constitutes a powerful economy sector with a sophisticated contingent of professionals and technical staff with salaries paid by resources arising from fiscal law that encourages philanthropy by individuals and marketing by corporations. Therefore, the confrontation in the museum's territories no longer takes place around the production of experience and knowledge. Rather, they are concerned with achieving goals and indicators with a view to financial and fiscal control, the optimization of investment and costs reduction. A mode of capitalist, business-oriented production is proposed for the experimental work of research, reflection, and education. Numbers and percentages are the main indicators of results, which are measured annually, analyzed, compared, evaluated. They influence and are reflected in the determination of policies and the strategies, causing eventual changes, of course, for the organization that work with the gaze and visual perception. It seems that there is no possibility or interest for qualitative criteria. But the question is, even though they are under continuous scrutiny, are the museums fostering a more knowledgeable and aware public, a more visually educated population, citizens with heightened responsibility who are committed to their time and place? Apparently they are not. This cultural consumption, organized with the greatest efficiency, does not favor the democratization of art so often stated as a goal, and even worse, it actually lowers the citizen's responsibilities. The visitor is told not only what she should look at, namely everything that is considered a must-see, but is also inculcated by way of an efficient didactic arsenal in regard to how she should look at the artwork. Everyone becomes adapted to the prevailing conditions of production. The sponsors need the museum for social insertion of their image or brand. The museum needs the public for its financial and ideological legitimacy. The public needs the museum as a delegate authority of knowledge and culture. In this system, the museums run the terrible risk of being guided by lines of the market, which tends to promote the qualities of formal intelligence above those of individual experience, of imagination, of subjectivity, which by means of art can be made to flourish in each individual. One of the most poetic criticisms of the museum is the text by Paul Valéry, The Problem of the Museum, published in 1923. At that moment, the museums enjoy a positive reputation among the public at large, and Valéry felt free to criticize them since the contemporary art at that time, modernism, was excluded from them. The author states, I don't like how the museums show an organized disorder of objects brought together arbitrarily and casuistically in the way they present their collection. The whole thing takes on the air of a temple, salon, cemetery, or class about what is being seen. Should I be instructed here or allow myself to be beguiled? Or should I seek here to fulfill my duties as a middle-class intellectual? According to him, even the perception is insulted and harmed in these rooms of incoherence, where an object competes with the next, robbing it of its meaning. The modern subject is impoverished by the excess of quarrels and dispute, including the fact that Venus is transformed into a historical document. The historical development of the museum has always been accompanied by criticism of them, but with a variety of arguments. We never speak of the same museum if we consider the various generations that have passed through it. Nevertheless, with the transformation of the museum to hubs of the tourism industry, the service become more important than the objects in them. The happening is more important than the expertise. Cultural heritage has become the theme of cultural industry, just as the cultural heritage industry has become the new mode of cultural production. Is this conception of the museum and its service in the institution's future? To what point can we believe in some effectiveness of this new economy which drives the already existing museum and creates new ones? I believe that the museum's future lies in the new form of that the museum's future lies not in the new form of tourism, but rather in a new definition of contents, which allows more space for contemplation and knowledge, seeking to foster a critical public, unlike the mass people avid for sensations. There is nothing wrong with the fact of having constructed cathedral for the art, places for the rituals of culture, but they should be a place of silence and reflection. Moreover, they should be spaces set apart from the noisy world of the spectre of culture, from the ceaseless flow of the information networks, from the rhetoric of corporative capital and the philanthropy of the elites. What we have to offer is a product of highest quality, and our goal should always be to contribute to the consumer spiritual and intellectual improvement. The conclusion is that it would be best to seriously assume the role of the art museum as a place for art, and this is not a tautology. The meaning of art can only be developed, incremented, and advanced when the symbolic institutional space is engaged in and coexists with art from the past. The museum cannot be legitimated only through the incorporation of the contemporary artistic practice by the demands of the circuit in which it is inserted. Art needs to point to its own genealogy in order to materialize any meaning it may have. One of the museum's noblest tasks is precisely that of guaranteeing the presence of art, ensuring the visibility of artworks that have already been made. Finally, I would like to observe that the debate on digitalization of the museums and the globalization is being waged in terms of mistaking approach and proposal. Assuming that the entire world can be digitalized, the museum is not being true to its identity when it makes its service part and parcel with this technology instead of only using them for ancillary purposes. Its possibility for broadcast and communicating seem infinite and constantly renewed. But it seems that the criticism that was made about André Malraux's Imaginary Museum concerning its artificial and reductive character still applies here. In his famous books, Malraux proposes a museum without walls, a museum in our minds, in which the demand of a real museum is substituted by the idea of a virtual museum. He was thinking not only about a museum without limits, but about an art without limits. A museum with the art of the entire world, a territory without categories. Malraux sought not only a shift of real space into the virtual, but also the replacement of originals by photographic reproduction of the artistic objects, create a complete collection of art by way of photographs, even though in many of them one sees only part of the object photographed. The author was thus proposing a global museum with works from everywhere, though in accordance with the perspective from the lens of Malraux's camera. This is any work that could be photographed could be admitted to the Imaginary Museum. As observed by critic Douglas Crimp, photography not only ensured the admission of various objects, but it was also a tool of organizing this museum. It reduces the vast heterogeneity of visual culture, of the experience of the place where it is or occurs, by a perfect similitude. Google Art does the same thing. For its part, the globalized world offers a unique opportunity for us to form a new conception of ourselves to the experience of difference and otherness. But this is also the necessary condition for the installation of a dialogue, of an exchange with other creative practices and culture. This process came hand in hand with a geographic opening that produced more than a widening of our field of vision, more than a simple displacement of the poles of interest. It put in question the established frontiers of the art world, namely the frontiers of the developed Western world under the hegemony of Europe and the United States. Thus, the local museum remains as an incorporator of local traditions and culture, not as a museum of folk and popular tradition, but as a privileged space of debates between the local and the global. We should understand that even the notion of Western implies a local character, notwithstanding the effort of modernism to propose and implement a universalizing project. Business people, ideologues, can argue about the fact that we are headed toward a global village, but the museums should be left outside of this, standing alone like parochial churches. What is the advantage of a globalized museum if the types of museum that can be reached physically or virtually exist everywhere in the world, reproducing themselves from one to the next one? It is not, therefore, the object, but rather the activity of the museum that can define its future. This is not a question of producing increasingly attractive spectacular exhibition with aim to increasing the number of visitors. More important, we need to determine if you want to enlarge or change the notion of the museum and the exhibition, or if we can conceive and propose enrich the notions of the enriching notions of them never attempted before. In any case, we must be careful about the spectacular nature of exhibition because, above all, this is aimed at a wide and indiscriminate public, an abstract entity at the center of the official policies for culture and sponsors. It's possible, therefore, to offer the public an alternative role. What would it be? By asking this question, my aim is to present a challenge, posing a question that perhaps does not have an answer. The important thing is to continue asking it, just as we should keep asking those questions related to all museums, which we have been debating about for years since their creation, the collection, the educational services, the temporary shows, the publication, the financial resources, etc. In its short history, the museum has already changed a lot and continues to change without his process having destroyed or weakened the institution. The museum is not different from the society that finances it and puts it into movement. Have we thought enough about the museum as a medium? It is a medium of knowledge and does not exist apart or in opposition to its use. A medium, what for? It seems to say for art no longer serves for the general terms that define. The museum as a medium, if understood as such, will not only be legitimate as an antipode to the mass communication medium. It invites us to engage in the experience of things and places. It offers us the possibility of constituting memory and recall. But it also invites us to intervene in the current technology and not to simply interact with them. It also seems that the museum can take on other roles different from those it has played up to now. If you accept these premises, this allows us to continue with the challenge of seeking new roles for the museum and for what we professionals in the field can do with it. Museums cannot accept to live the created reality, but instead has to be a place for organizing a new negotiated reality. Thank you so much.
Behind schedule, and that there is several tables of enticing wine outside, which I don't want to keep you from for too long, but it would seem to be a great shame not to have time for 2 or 3 questions after 2 such stimulating and ramificatory talks. So are there 1 or 2 questions we could have before pursuing this a little more informally next door? Anyone? Yes. Peter.
I have a question for William Kentridge. There was an interesting sort of double element in your talk between. Sorry. Is it on?
Yeah.
Doesn't seem to be on. Is it? Okay. Where on the one hand you were talking about this as a general point about how we all think in all contexts. On the other hand, you were talking about it as a very specific way of thinking in the studio. And I know from some other comments that you've made in other fora that you you're also very interested actually in the interplay between different kinds of thinking. So I just wondered if you could comment a little bit more on that sort of tension between the distinctiveness and difference of this kind of thinking and this actually as a guide to general thinking.
Well, I think, firstly, it's always a reverse engineering. I mean, the impulse is there to make those drawings and the sculptures and the turning sculptures, and then they've got to be justified in a way, which is what the structure of the lecture then tries to do. But what I'm trying to test in this talk and in others is to what extent processes that feel completely natural in the studio in the way that artists have always worked, in terms of making drawings, making paintings, arriving at the images, are instructive or similar to processes that we have in the way we understand the world, not necessarily unconsciously, but automatically, naturally. So we see in a studio you very construct a collage, one thing is stuck against another. But when you walk through the world, you assume you are seeing the world as it is, rather than assuming, well, I'm seeing all these huge number of different fractions and fragments which I'm constructing into something which I believe I've seen. You can understand that very easily, for example, with a stereoscope. When you walk through the world, you assume you're seeing 3 dimensions. You're walking through 3 dimensions, so you assume that is what you are seeing. It's a natural activity. When you see a stereoscopic photograph, you have 2 flat photographs. You can see it's a flat photograph. There's no depth in it if you look at one eye. And yet if you look through a stereoscope, there's a certain moment where these 2 flat images your 2 eyes are seeing join together and produce this depth. And so what you're very aware of in that moment is that that is something your brain is doing. It's acting like a muscle and transforming what is flat into an appearance of depth. So you're very aware of that as something that you yourself are doing, are constructing that sense of the world. But if you go through the world, we're doing exactly the same thing. Each eye picks up a flat image on its retina, and when you put the 2 together with the distance between them, we have this sensation of extraordinary depth. And that becomes invisible. That normal seeing becomes invisible, what we are doing. So I think it's that sense that the processes of the studio and that kind of thinking is not saying all thinking is like that, but it's for me it's sometimes revealing of the way we make a completeness or coherence out of what is in fact fragments that require our agency to turn them into a naturalistic coherence.
I should have said you have to wait for the microphone to come to you. I'm sorry, my omission. Another question? Yes.
This is another question for Professor Kentridge, and it's to ask whether, or the extent to which your work in process, in which this lecture and even these questions might be included, is a kind of reinvention of the genre of self-portraiture.
I mean, the coffee pot was a kind of a facetious self-portrait, although a series of different coffee pots. But I think it is in the sense that that double portrait in the studio, for example, the making of the artist as maker and the artist as viewer, drawing that rhinoceros, is a kind of displaced self-portrait. And a lot of the films I've made have kind of been self-portraits in the third person, so to speak. I haven't thought of it in those terms, but it's an interesting trajectory. Thank you.
Any more? One up there and then one down here.
Yeah, I would like to congratulate Ivo Mesquita. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was very good. I had found that in museums in England, I found that the colonial part is not very the labels in the museums sometimes are they lack lots of information about all the colonial times. And I think that should be raised in the museums curating. I think it's very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to comment on it?
Sorry, I think I didn't got your point. So it's like we're talking about colonial what?
Colonial references in English museums.
Oh,
should be more fully explicated.
Oh, I see. Okay. What do you mean? This is a hot topic, okay? So or deep waters, you know? So it's like going back in the presence of colonial art. Well, we were talking today in the lunch about a little bit about this presence of colonial art in European museums and what it means. I think there's a whole debate about this, you know, because it's like I told this story when with Brazil and Argentina, we had this in around 1870. We for 7 years we had a war against Paraguay, and Paraguay it's still a poor country until today because of they never recovered from that war, you know. And there is this story about this, and Brazil brought from Paraguay at the end of the war the main canyon existing in Paraguay, okay, that today is in Brazil, the main Brazil history museum in Rio de Janeiro. Recently, Paraguay started asking back for the canyon to be sent back, you know, and there's a whole debate in the country if we should send back or not, you know. It is interesting because we, the museum people, we are against sending back the canyon to Paraguay. We don't agree with that because that is part of our history, is how we destroyed that country. That's a monument that we did. So that is for our memory, to keep our memory about that. I don't know if I answered your question. On what we have done.
Okay, there's one last question here, and then we'll go next door for a more informal conversation.
Yes, my question actually was for Ivo Mesquita. And I was wondering how, I was amazed at that building, the Lina Bardi building, how much of an effect that has had on...
How much?
On the, it was interesting how it seemed to be very pivotal to you.
Oh yes, because it was such a radical moment, you know, in her architecture, and also conceiving a museum like that, you know, in this very brutalist. We have this, okay, because that's why I show in the first image was the Fine Arts Museum in Rio, which was this very European-like, and then she comes with this proposal of this very, let's say, cutting edge, I don't like the word, but anyway, this cutting edge architecture, you know, this brutalist, you know, that's look and finish it, you know, it's like it's raw concrete, you know, and having all this artwork, this beautiful artwork inside. That was quite provocative, absolutely, to see that, you know, it's like, of course, because you have this, this mythical thing about European museums, you know, and then you come this Italian architect and doing this, well, come on, no, let's flat everything, you know, so it's like, it's very important. I think Lina was a very, I'm not a big fan of all her architecture, but I am a big fan of her writings and thinking, you know, the things how how provocative she was, and how stimulating she was in for the cultural intellectual scene in São Paulo and in Brazil.
Lovely. Well, before going next door, can we please thank our two speakers for a couple of extremely distinguished lectures?